You're with Julian on the Brown Note and Jimmy Carr and a defence of irony. Jimmy Carr, the British comedian who is best known as a host of shows like 8 out of 10 Cats Do Countdown, the most awesomest show of the modern era, released a new stand-up called His Dark Materials in December. And for some reason, this has blown up now into an international incident. I don't know if there's a coincidence between Whoopi Goldberg's Holocaust problems, where she said that the Holocaust wasn't a race issue. One of the most misguided comments you could probably make on national television. Or she's got the best PR people in the world, but Jimmy Carr seems to have taken over. So for some reason, this clip that came out in the 25th of December has in February gone viral and evoked worldwide condemnation. That I really want to do a defense here of comedy. And I'm not making any friends because nobody else has come out in support of Jimmy Carr here at all. So the joke in question that has invoked universal condemnation is the following. Jimmy Carr said, when people talk about the Holocaust, they talk about the tragedy and horror of 6 million Jewish lives being lost to the Nazi war machine. But they never mention the thousands of gypsies that were killed by the Nazis. No one ever talks about that because no one ever wants to talk about the positives. Now, this joke that has been on Netflix for 2 months now has invoked universal condemnation because obviously hundreds of thousands of Roma who are ascribed the pejorative term at various points. Gypsy, I don't think it's as much a pejorative term as it was. And are spread throughout Europe and subject to, a lot of systemic racism because of where they come from. And the fact that so many of them were killed in the Holocaust, possibly the next highest group next to the Jews, as well as being rounded up by the Nazis. Now, do you really think that Jimmy Carr's meant that he was glad about Roma people being executed in the Holocaust? Or do you think that this was an ironic joke? Now, this is what the joke means. And to me, it is obvious. He is saying that a society which universally condemns the racism towards the Jews during the Holocaust are still kind of okay with the systemic racism Roma face today. That is an ironic joke. Now, the problem we have with cancel culture today is that it is entirely 100% literal. Every single sentence is taken at face value to be literal. So we have no things like context or irony involved in cancel culture. We have cancel culture reading a sentence from a tweet and applying literalism to it. You know, there's no such thing as context with racism anymore. A 14-year-old girl singing the N-word in a Kendrick Lamar lyric isn't racism, but it is now. It really isn't. If you look at the context of racism, you can be really racist and not say the N-word. Singing a lyric to a rap song at a concert wasn't racist in the 90s or in the 2000s, but it is today because cancel culture has decided that using a word is. But cancel culture can't deal with our most sophisticated forms of communication. And comedy is at the vanguard of our lyrical expression. It pushes the boundaries about what's acceptable and finds a no man's land between what's unacceptable and what is, and continually explores this fertile ground. And two of the most important elements and most sophisticated parts of human discourse are irony and also satire. So irony and satire are two methods of communication where the literal meaning of something isn't true. where there's a deeper meaning, often the inverse of what's being said. And these are common elements in comedy. But cancel culture can't handle that because it needs literalism. It needs to be literal about what's being said. No one in their right mind can think that Jimmy Carr meant that joke literally. It's not even a remotely subtle irony. He makes a very good ironic joke, which also puts one foot into shock comedy. Shock comedy, ironic comedy, and satire are all three very valid, important areas for comedy to operate in that are immediately in the targets of cancel culture. No one can think that Jimmy Carr meant that. He was being ironic about the fact that racism against the Roma are commonplace today by making this appalling, ironic comment. He was talking about racism, and no one has stood up for him for that. Everyone has piled on him just for the literal meaning of those sentences. This is irony. Irony is feigned ignorance in its broadest sense, a rhetorical device and literary technique or event which on the surface appears to be the case or to be expected, differs radically from what is actually true. The psychologist Rod A. Martin, in The Psychology of Humour, is quite clear that irony is where the literal meaning is opposite to the intended. No one seems to have got this joke. It's not even a hard joke to get. It was obvious from the first time I heard it, but now we're in a situation where anyone that's offended will stay offended. So people that didn't get the joke, and quite frankly, if you're not smart enough to get the joke, you're not smart enough to cancel it. But people who were offended at the start and have had the joke explained to them are still offended, because that's how it works now. There isn't anything offensive about the joke apart from the fact that the Roma are still subject to systemic racism. And comedians should not be cut off at the knees for utilising irony or satire or shock humour to get their point across. Now, even shock humour is valid as far as comedians go. Comedy is sacrosanct. Comedy is where uncomfortable truths still are allowed to be expressed. We have a long history of our most important comedians making fertile ground out of areas that are hugely problematic. Lenny Bruce, look at his work with the N-word. How do you think that would go down now? It was an entirely valid, clever, and important comedic point he made. Look at George Carlin, a lot of the stuff that he said. And the godfather of modern shock political commentary, Bill Hicks, who is arguably the most important comedian of the last 40 years. These people operate in a territory that is a minefield, and they might occasionally get it wrong, but I don't even think he got it wrong here. I thought he made a really crushingly brutal point with a joke using irony. That's a valid field to plough if you're a comedian. What are we going to do with people that are some of my favourite comedians today? Bill Burr, Doug Stanhope, and Dave Chappelle. Well, we've seen what's happened with Dave Chappelle. I offered my opinion on that over a long period of time last year. These are people that will utilise very upsetting terminology, scenarios in an ironic way or in a shocking way to make wider points. It isn't about what's literally being said. And Jimmy Carr didn't do anything wrong. He made a very good ironic joke, and apparently a few months after he made it, it has now become this thing because we pile on to people. But comedy is something that is going to be needed to be defended against cancel culture, because you're using irony or satire or shock, it is going to operate necessarily in a world that cancel culture cannot handle through its unbearable literary take on every sentence that's made. So I do stand in support of Jimmy Carr's right to make that joke. I do think that joke was a good joke, and no, I don't think the meaning of it was anti-Roma at all.